A convoy of luxury SUVs races down the lonely Wahat Road outside Cairo under the cover of dusk. Inside one vehicle sits a heavy-set man, sweat on his brow, eyes scanning the empty desert ahead. This is Saeed Zainhem, a notorious smuggler whose criminal empire has thrived in the shadows of Egypt's turmoil. For years, he believed himself untouchable, protected by wealth and powerful allies. But tonight, the law is lying in wait. As the convoy rounds a bend, headlights erupt from the darkness, an ambush. Gunshots crack through the dry air. In minutes, it's over. Saeed and his henchmen are surrounded and arrested after a brief firefight on that highway in 2013. Thus begins the final chapter in the saga of Egypt's so-called Tramadol emperor.
Saeed Zaim's story reads like a cinematic thriller, a rise from obscurity to underworld kingpin, set against the backdrop of revolution and chaos. He was an opportunist of the highest order, a man who built a multi-million-dollar drug smuggling empire by exploiting Egypt's instability. At his peak, Saeed armed protesters and dined with political power brokers, moving between worlds with chameleon-like ease. His downfall, when it came, was dramatic and symbolically rich, the criminal prince brought low by the very chaos that once empowered him. To understand how Saeed Zaim rose and fell, we must rewind to the beginning of his journey, tracing the background, rise to power, Tramadol empire, political entanglements, and the climactic 2013 capture that finally ended his reign.
Years before his name filled newspaper headlines, Saeed Hassan Abu el-Gait, known as Saeed Zainhem, was an ordinary young man in the Nile Delta town of Nabro. Born around 1976, he came from modest means, a high school trade diploma, no distinguished pedigree. But what Saeed lacked in status, he made up for in ambition and cunning. In his early 20s, he developed a burning desire to get rich quick at any cost, convinced that a fortune would buy him the respect he craved. Nabro, his hometown, quietly teemed with examples of dubious success. Local big shots flaunted wealth from import-export businesses that often skirted the law. Watching them, Saeed learned a crucial lesson. In Egypt's gray markets, boldness and deceit could pay off handsomely. Personality-wise, Saeed was anything but the silent mastermind trope. He was loud, jovial, and deceitful. From youth, he was known as a relentless talker and spinner of tales, a man who could lie with a straight face and sow rumors just for amusement. Physically, he was even more conspicuous. Years of excess had endowed him with morbid obesity. At one point, he weighed around 240 kilograms, over 500 pounds. Far from slowing him down, his imposing girth became part of his legend. In Nabro's underworld, he earned the nickname Sheikh al-Dib, meaning the bear, for his massive size and appetite. Saeed loved fine food as much as easy money. Associates later quipped that his gluttony was exceeded only by his greed. Yet, despite standing out in any crowd, he managed to stay a step ahead of the law in his early career. By 2008, aside from a few minor fraud complaints over unpaid debts, Saeed had avoided any serious criminal charges. He operated with impunity, projecting himself publicly as a successful young businessman. In local society, he played the role of a benefactor and problem solver, currying favor with officials by presenting a respectable facade. Beneath that veneer, however, a much larger scheme was taking shape, one that would soon earn him infamy far beyond his hometown.
By the late 2000s, Saeed Zainhem's ambitions had far outgrown bootleg electronics and fake designer clothes. He was ready to stake his claim as a kingpin. In 2008, as Egypt braced for political change, Saeed moved his base of operations abroad to Amman, Jordan, putting distance between himself and local authorities. From there, he orchestrated an expansion into more lucrative and dangerous contraband, drugs and weapons. His product of choice was tramadol, a painkiller turned narcotic that had exploded in popularity on Egypt's streets. Tramadol pills could be bought for pennies in bulk and resold to eager Egyptian consumers seeking a cheap high or relief from hardship. Said recognized a golden opportunity.
As the tramadol flowed, so did money, rivers of it. Said's organization funneled the proceeds through a web of exchange companies and couriers. In one scheme, young men were sent on quick trips to the Gulf carrying suitcases stuffed with cash wrapped in aluminum foil to evade airport X-rays. These couriers would fly to Dubai or Amman with millions of Egyptian pounds in secret compartments, convert the money via offshore accounts or currency swaps, and then return after a day or two, earning a small fee while Said reaped enormous profits from exchange rate arbitrage. The operation moved hundreds of millions in currency out of Egypt, whitening dirty cash into usable assets, all under the guidance of a lawyer on Said's payroll who had ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. By around 2010, Said Zainem had cemented himself as Egypt's most prolific drug smuggler. In just 7 years, he had flooded the country and its neighbors with billions of tramadol pills, alongside other contraband like weapons, counterfeit medicines, hazardous fake cigarettes, and even fireworks. His smuggling empire spanned at least 10 countries, from India and China, where the pills were made, to transit points like the UAE, Turkey, and Malta, and bordering nations like Libya, Sudan, and Syria. The profits were staggering. Estimates later indicated Said amassed roughly 3 billion Egyptian pounds in wealth, over 400 million USD, stored as cash or invested in properties and businesses under false names. He owned villas and flats in Cairo, Alexandria, the Delta, and even overseas. Ever cautious, he registered assets in the names of relatives or associates without criminal records, holding leverage over them through signed documents to ensure they wouldn't cross him. Dozens of criminal operatives, from local gangsters to corrupt officials across Egypt's provinces, were on his payroll, forming a vast patronage network. In under a decade, the paunchy young man from Nabro had become Emperor of Tramadol, a title whispered in underworld circles and splashed in later press reports. Yet with great notoriety comes great risk. Said's activities had not gone entirely unnoticed by law enforcement. In mid-2009, an anti-narcotics unit in the Delta caught 2 of his couriers with 500,000 tramadol pills at a checkpoint, a seizure that was directly traced back to Said's operation abroad. It was the first concrete case against him, officially alerting authorities to the emergence of this new drug lord. But Said was safely out of the country at the time and treated the incident as a minor setback. Indeed, when an arrest warrant was issued, he ignored it. The case proceeded in his absence and was soon bogged down in legal technicalities. A year later, in 2010, another massive shipment, 20 million tramadol tablets, hidden in a 40-foot sea container, was intercepted at Alexandria port. This was contraband on an unprecedented scale, and once more investigators tied it to Said's syndicate. He and his collaborators were prosecuted, some in person, others in absentia, and received a 3-year prison sentence, not that it made any difference while Said remained out of reach abroad. Buoyed by endless profits and reassurances from his lawyers, Said grew bolder. He viewed these cases as the cost of doing business, mere scratches on an otherwise impenetrable armor. Little did he suspect that the upheavals about to rock Egypt would open new doors for his enterprise and ultimately accelerate his downfall. Ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Rabaa sit-in. January 2011, revolution erupted in Egypt, toppling President Hosni Mubarak and plunging the nation into political uncertainty. To many, it was a moment of hope. To savvy operators like Said Zainem, it was also an opening. Amid the chaos of the post-revolution power struggle, Egypt's security apparatus was in disarray, and old cases against criminals like Said suddenly weren't priorities. Sensing this, an influential friend reached out to Said with a plan. This friend was a well-known political figure, a party leader with ties to the emerging Islamist power brokers. Unbeknownst to most, he was also a distant relative of Said's and a key financier of the Muslim Brotherhood. He urged Said to come back to Egypt, promising that the new order would be more forgiving of past transgressions. In February 2011, mere weeks after Mubarak's fall, Said brazenly flew into Cairo International Airport. He was promptly detained on those lingering warrants, but here the chaos played to his advantage. Within days, thanks to behind-the-scenes lobbying and legal maneuvering, Said was released and all his old convictions were overturned on appeal. The state had bigger problems than a fugitive smuggler, and Said's political connections greased the wheels. This taste of impunity and revolutionary Cairo only reinforced what Said already believed: fortune favored the bold. His politician friend's advice had proven right and cemented their bond. In gratitude, Said agreed to an introduction that would change the trajectory of his life, a meeting with Hayrat al-Shatter, the powerful deputy leader of the Muslim Brotherhood.
By 2012, the Muslim Brotherhood had ascended to power through elections, with Mohamed Morsi as president. But their grip on Egypt was tenuous, and they were preparing for turbulent times. At a discreet villa in an upscale Cairo suburb, Said Zenhem met with Hayrat al-Shatter and other Brotherhood officials. The Brotherhood's need was simple: arms and money to secure their rule and counter their rivals. And Said, the smuggler extraordinaire, had both in abundance. Over lavish refreshments, Said laid out how his smuggling routes could just as easily bring in guns as they did drugs. Shatter, impressed by Said's wolf-like cunning and logistical savvy, agreed to a devil's bargain. The Brotherhood would allow Said's tramadol empire to operate with little interference, perhaps even facilitate it, and in return, Said would help equip the Brotherhood's cadres and allies. It was a mutually beneficial pact born of desperation and greed. To ease any moral hesitation among the Islamist leaders about profiting from narcotics, Said spun a clever pitch. Tramadol isn't really a dangerous drug, he argued with a grin. It's just a pill to help men perform better in their marital duties, nothing that harms the faithful. This absurd rationalization evidently satisfied his audience, or at least gave them cover to look the other way. The meeting ended with warm handshakes and a shared vision. Said would be the Brotherhood's unofficial quartermaster, smuggling whatever was needed through his clandestine pipelines. In the shadows of Egypt's nascent Islamist government, a criminal alliance was born. Said wasted no time proving his value. Over the next year, he allegedly facilitated the influx of weapons and cash to Brotherhood-linked groups. But his most dramatic show of support came in the summer of 2013 during the infamous Rabaa al-Adawiyah sit-in. By late June 2013, President Morsi was facing mass protests against his rule. On July 3rd, the military removed him from power, and in response, the Brotherhood and its supporters began a large sit-in at Rabaa Square in Cairo, demanding Morsi's reinstatement. This protest camp became the focal point of a national crisis, and Said Zenhem saw an opportunity to both solidify his Brotherhood ties and further his own interests. With Morsi ousted, the Brotherhood needed resources and morale to sustain their protest. Said, now flush with illicit cash and a stake in the Brotherhood's survival, stepped forward in a big way.
Every day that July, trucks quietly departed a makeshift kitchen in the industrial city of Badr, east of Cairo. Their destination? Rabaa Square. Their cargo? Thousands of gourmet meals and boxes of pills. Said had effectively turned himself into the chief quartermaster of the sit-in. He arranged for 2,000 hot meals to be prepared daily for the encamped protesters. These weren't simple ration kits. They were lavish plates of meat, rice, and fruit. 5-star quality food to keep morale high. Said even slaughtered 20 cattle each morning to provide fresh beef for the masses. Under his direction, a team of cooks toiled in an unlicensed food plant, nominally a pharmaceutical factory owned by one of his partners, to churn out the feast. The logistics were as impressive as any military supply line. And tucked amid the food supplies were Said's signature party favors, large quantities of tramadol, handed out to those who needed an extra boost of stamina or oblivion. By design, some of these pills found their way into the hands of young men guarding the sit-in, often petty criminals and street toughs whom the Brotherhood had recruited with cash. Keeping these irregulars content and dependent on the drug made them more loyal and easier to manage. When Said's convoy of supplies rolled into Rabaa, he was welcomed like a hero. Protesters cheered the arrival of the food trucks laden with styrofoam boxes of steaming meals and sacks of fruit. Said himself made frequent personal appearances at the camp, basking in the gratitude and fanfare. Here was a kingpin openly parading in a protest, hiding in plain sight behind the veneer of philanthropy. The rotund smuggler would lumber into the square, greeted by hugs and shouts. Owing to his colossal size, the organizers had a special oversized couch ready for him in the shade of a tent, a makeshift throne for the man supplying their daily bread. Said would settle into the couch, watching with satisfaction as Brotherhood volunteers distributed his 5-star meals to the hungry crowd. On his face, witnesses said, was pure joy, the glee of a man who finally felt truly powerful. It was likely the happiest moment of Said's life. He had transcended mere drug trafficking to become a central player, albeit covertly, in a historic political drama. From his cushioned seat, Said would make a daily phone call to none other than Hayrat al-Shatter, who himself would soon be imprisoned by the new regime. Speaking in a conspiratorial tone, Said reassured the Brotherhood's strongman that everything at the sit-in was under control, and their supporters were well taken care of. He even addressed Shatter as El Reis, meaning the chief or boss, like a loyal lieutenant reporting to his commander. After hanging up, Said often took things a step further. He'd waddle back to his Mercedes and retrieve boxes of tramadol pills, handing them off to a man named Bilal, one of the protest organizers, for distribution among select groups in the camp. These groups included the rougher elements the Brotherhood had brought in as enforcers, as well as peddlers who sold knickknacks around the square, and any others whom a dose of narcotic might keep docile. By this point, Said's criminal and political worlds had fully merged. He was arming the Brotherhood with hot meals and addictive pills, and even privately promising to procure firearms for the sit-in if it came under attack. In the eyes of the Brotherhood's rank and file, Said was a godsend, a portly guardian angel feeding them and bolstering their resolve. They affectionately dubbed him Sheikh El-Deeb, the Bear, a nickname that acknowledged his generous girth and generous support alike. Said likely reveled in this new moniker. It gave a quasi-mythic aura to the local boy turned kingpin now playing with the big leagues.
However, even as Said enjoyed his heyday at Rabaa, others were watching. The Egyptian security forces, though initially caught off guard by the scale of the sit-in, quickly learned of the strange benefactor in the Galabeah supplying the protest. Intelligence units pieced together who Said Zainham really was, not some benevolent caterer, but a notorious smuggler bankrolling and equipping a defiant encampment. Day after day they monitored his visits, noting the crates unloaded from his Mercedes, tracking where he went and whom he spoke to. To the interim military-backed government, Said became a high-value target. He was not only breaking drug and arms laws on a grand scale, but also propping up what they viewed as an armed insurgent gathering. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, one that would come sooner than Said expected. Capture in 2013 and fall. The end came on a hot summer night, not long before the Rabaa sit-in itself would be forcibly cleared. Following weeks of surveillance, Egyptian authorities decided it was time to cut off the Brotherhood's hidden supply line and nab the tramadol emperor in the process. They knew storming the Rabaa camp to snatch Said could spark a bloodbath. Instead, they chose a subtler approach: catch him in transit, away from the crowds. Thus, on an evening in late July 2013, police units set up a secret checkpoint on the Wahat Road, a desolate highway stretching from Cairo toward the western desert. This was a route Said often took to travel between the city and his supply centers. The plan was risky. Saeed's convoy was known to be armed, and a shootout on open roads was a real possibility. But the security forces were determined. As Saeed's black Mercedes and several escort vehicles sped down the dark highway, the trap was sprung. Blinding spotlights flipped on, engines revved, and armed officers moved in from concealment. Saeed's drivers, realizing the danger too late, attempted to run the blockade. Someone in the convoy opened fire, and the police returned in kind. For a brief, chaotic moment, the desert echoed with gunfire and screeching tires. When the dust settled, the result was unequivocal. Saeed Zainham, the mighty bear of Rabba, the untouchable smuggler who had dined with kingmakers, was caught like a rat in a trap. He and 11 members of his crew, including his own brother, were yanked from their vehicles and taken into custody, some bruised and bloodied from the skirmish. In the cars, authorities found a jaw-dropping arsenal. 809 Turkish-made pump-action shotguns, likely destined for militant hands, along with 6 luxury vehicles and sacks of cash totaling $144,000, plus nearly 100,000 Egyptian pounds. It was a rolling treasure trove of weapons and money, now in the hands of the state. The sheer scale of the seizure underscored just how audacious Saeed's operation had become. At the very same time, another strike was unfolding. A second police team raided the covert kitchen in Badr City that had been feeding the Rabba sit-in. There they found tons of meat, rice, and cooking supplies, neatly prepared to sustain the protesters. Tangible evidence of the daily 2,000 meals Saeed had been providing. The Badr factory was shut down on the spot, its staff arrested while stirring giant cauldrons of stew. In one coordinated sweep, Saeed's lifelines to the Brotherhood were severed. The Tramadol Emperor's empire was imploding. In the aftermath of the arrest, Saeed cut a far less imposing figure. Photos circulated of a morose, heavy man in prison whites, dwarfed by armed guards on either side. The Brotherhood's protest at Rabba would tragically be crushed by security forces on August 14, 2013, but Saeed watched those events unfold from a prison cell, his fate already sealed independent of the political showdown. Once in custody, Saeed faced a blizzard of legal charges. Decades' worth of crimes were now catching up all at once. In a courtroom in Tanta, a city in the Nile Delta, a judge swiftly convicted Saeed in absentia for that earlier tramadol shipment case, slapping Saeed with 15 years of heavy labor prison time and a 500,000 EGP fine. This was the first of many blows. In Cairo, the main trial for his recent activities, dubbed the major arms case in the press, Saeed and his co-conspirators before a panel of judges. He spared no expense on his defense, hiring top lawyers, including a prominent female attorney known for defending controversial figures. But the evidence was overwhelming. Detailed surveillance records, testimony from arrested aides, the physical haul of weapons and drugs. It left little room for doubt. The Cairo Criminal Court found Saeed guilty on multiple counts of smuggling and weapons possession. The kingpin, who had once lorded over a vast network, was sentenced to 7 more years in prison, on top of the 15. His brother, who had been caught in the convoy, was acquitted. Perhaps the court saw him as a minor player. The remaining members of the crew each received 3-year sentences. All told, Saeed Zainham now faced 22 years behind bars, a cumulative punishment for his reign of crime. Bearing a miracle, he would not walk free until he was an old man, if at all.
The fall of the bear sent shockwaves through the underworld and beyond. Saeed's countless beneficiaries, corrupt officials on his payroll, fellow smugglers, petty crooks who depended on his largesse, suddenly found their meal ticket gone. In the weeks after his conviction, Egyptian security services detected frantic activity among Said's associates. Some attempted to strike back in subtler ways. A smear campaign emerged, spreading false rumors to tarnish the reputations of the police officers and investigators who had brought him down. It was an attempt at revenge and an effort to muddy the waters, likely orchestrated by big beneficiaries of the smuggler's money, as one report described. Anonymous accusations and conspiracy theories floated in the media, aimed at discrediting the heroes of the bust. But these tactics gained little traction. The public mood had shifted decisively against the Brotherhood, and by extension, against characters like Said, who were seen as having fueled the country's unrest. The authorities stood by their officers, and the campaign of lies fizzled out. All it really accomplished was to underscore how deeply Said's corruption had seeped into some corners of society, that even after his arrest, there were those willing to do his bidding. Yet they were fighting a losing battle. Said Zainem was finished, and now the government turned to the arduous task of dismantling what remained of his empire. Investigators began tracing his hidden assets and fronts, initiating legal processes to confiscate his ill-gotten wealth. The Emperor of Tramadol had been dethroned, and the cleanup had begun. Final reflections and societal impact. The saga of Said Zainem is a cautionary tale of greed, power, and the dark symbiosis between crime and politics. In a span of less than a decade, Said morphed from a small-town hustler into a linchpin of both the narcotics trade and, improbably, a revolutionary movement. His rise was enabled by the chaos of historic events, the collapse of an old regime, the ascent of a new, and the tumult that filled the gap. When institutions faltered, Said seized his chance, proving that opportunists can thrive in the gray areas of upheaval. He slipped through cracks in the system, forged alliances with those who should have shunned him, and in so doing pushed an entire nation deeper into crisis by flooding it with addictive drugs and illicit arms. For a time, it almost seemed that Said might get away with it all. His story could have ended with him as a permanent untouchable, a secret multimillionaire living above the law. But Said's hubris became his undoing. Emboldened by each lucky break, he flew closer to the sun, taking ever greater risks until he was operating in plain view, handing out tramadol on camera at a protest. In aligning himself so publicly with the Brotherhood's Rabba sit-in, he all but ensured the state's wrath would come for him. His arrest and the exposure of his deeds served as a stark example that even amid political strife, the rule of law can reassert itself brutally and decisively. The impact of Said's downfall reverberated through Egyptian society. In the immediate sense, taking him out removed a major source of illegal tramadol that had been wreaking havoc on Egyptian youth. Tramadol addiction had surged during the early 2010s, becoming a quiet epidemic, and Said was arguably the single largest contributor to this scourge. Shutting his pipeline likely spared many from the fate of dependency, and it sent a strong signal to other would-be drug barons. Moreover, his case pulled back the curtain on the clandestine funding of the Rabba sit-in and other Islamist activities. The revelation that a criminal was bankrolling and arming a political protest dealt a heavy blow to the Brotherhood's moral standing in the eyes of many Egyptians. It fit neatly into the new government's narrative that the Rabba protest camp was not a peaceful gathering, but a heavily supplied, even drug-laced stronghold, a narrative used to justify the forceful dispersal. In that regard, Said's legacy was to inadvertently tarnish the cause he had sought to support, illustrating how crime and extremism can feed off each other, undermining legitimate grievances with the stain of illicit activity. On a deeper level, the rise and fall of Said Zainem highlights the resilience of the Egyptian state. Even after periods of apparent lawlessness, there remained those in law enforcement who meticulously worked to bring criminals like Said to justice. The coordination between anti-drug agencies, national security, and police in his capture was lauded as a bright spot of interagency cooperation in protecting the nation. It showed that while it might take time, the state could indeed regroup and strike back against those who exploited its weakness. The image of Said's arrest, his convoy halted in the desert, weapons seized, the mighty kingpin in handcuffs, became an almost cinematic representation of accountability. It was a message to any remaining crime lords: no one who betrays their country for profit, no matter how powerful they seem, is beyond justice.
Emotionally, Said's journey can be read as a twisted arc of a man who wanted respect and power and briefly got it, only to lose everything. He soared high on the fumes of revolution, thinking himself a master player in Egypt's destiny. But in the end, he was neither hero nor ideologue, just a criminal caught in the wheels of history. As he languishes in prison, perhaps he reflects on the empire he built and destroyed with equal parts audacity and folly. The Tramadol emperor, once catered to with a throne-like couch amid adoring followers, now sits on a cold cell bunk, reduced from myth to mere mortal. His story stands as a gripping chapter in Egypt's modern history, a blend of crime thriller and cautionary documentary, reminding us how quickly fortunes can turn when one flies too close to the sun. Ultimately, the fall of Said Zainem was more than just the capture of a drug smuggler. It was the symbolic toppling of a figure who personified the dark side of Egypt's revolution. And as the dust settled, society was left to reckon with the damage he had done and the lives he had touched, from the addicts who craved his pills, to the protesters who ate from his hands, to the cronies who enriched themselves under his wing. In that reckoning lies the true impact of his saga. It prompts questions about how to prevent the next Said Zainem, how to fortify a nation's institutions so that opportunists cannot so easily entwine themselves with movements and exploit the vulnerable. For now, his tale endures as a potent narrative of rise and fall, one that will be told in hushed tones and dramatic reenactments for years to come. The story of the smuggler who tried to play kingmaker and paid the ultimate price for his ambition. The Tramadol emperor is dead. May Egypt learn from his legacy.